We find ourselves in John chapter 8 this morning. And before we even get to the text, I want to talk about some of the history behind this scripture passage first. There's so much to be said here. The earliest and most reliable manuscripts we have don't even include chapter 753, chapter 8, verse 11. It's simply not there. Obviously, somewhere along the way, it was included. We don't know by whom, and we don't exactly know when. But it is a story that biblical scholars overwhelmingly agree was a true story that legitimately happened. It is sound in doctrine. It is true to the nature of Jesus. And it certainly fits the narrative that's actually going on here, which is seemingly the reason it was included in this. So it's a beautiful passage, a very familiar story that I think we probably would all know here. But it's just an interesting placing because actually if you look at chapter 7, verse 52, it actually connects better with chapter 8, verse 12. This seems to be a bit of an aside, as if they're going through the Feast of the Booths and Jesus is walking and talking, and the reaction and response to the crowd is such, and then there's this bit of an aside with this interaction he has with this woman called adultery, and then it seems to return back to the original narrative. But regardless of this beautiful thing, and because of its legitimacy, we're going to look at it today together. Now, there's a little bit more history to this. March 16th, 1997, over 30 years ago, this passage was the first sermon I ever preached. So it has a bit of a connection with me here. It was later I understood the controversies behind it before I preached that, so way to go there. But it's a beautiful thing, and I remember very clearly that day that I was supposed to preach my very first sermon, and people continued to ask me, are you nervous? Are you getting nervous about it? Are you wound up? And just continued as they got closer, people continued to ask me more, about being nervous about it. And I really wasn't. I really didn't have any nervousness about getting up and preaching this passage. And as people continued to ask, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I should be nervous about this. And so I prayed and says, God, is everything okay here? And I felt very clearly God impressed upon me. I've done this plenty of times before. You have nothing to worry about. And God has been faithful for over 30 years in allowing me to preach His Word and do these kinds of things. So let's look together at chapter 7, verse 53 through chapter 8, verse 11. They each went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who'd been caught in adultery, and placing her in his midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law of Moses, it commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? This they said to test him, that they might give him some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. So as it has been his custom, Jesus is there in Jerusalem. Perhaps it is for the feast. But in this oral tradition has been passed down, Jesus leaves Jerusalem and he goes up to the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives is just outside the city, and we had a really deep discussion about this past Wednesday night. But what he is doing is what most pilgrims would do. If you weren't from Jerusalem, if you came there for one of the feasts, at night you would typically go to the Mount of Olives and you would stay there. And Jesus was known to go there. He would go there with his disciples and spend time with them. He would go there and pray. And it goes on and on. It's a very special place in Jerusalem's history, and it continues to be that today, as so much has happened there and so much is expected to happen there as it goes on. The next day he comes back. He's back to the temple, and he begins to teach the people, and people gather around him. And this is not uncommon either. Rabbis would typically go in, sometimes the scribes would, and they would stand among the people in the crowds, and they would teach. And they would expound upon the scriptures, and they would tell people about the law and what the prophets had said and the kind of things that they were supposed to be doing. Crowds would gather around them, but Jesus did the same thing. But Jesus is different. Because Jesus doesn't just reference other rabbis and stuff like that and things that they had taught, and he doesn't talk about people that they really don't know. He expounds with such authority that he completely understands and completely gets everything that's happening. He gives them such clarity what the scriptures say to them that people are absolutely just drawn to him, and they circle around him, and they listen to him, and they had to be just hanging on his every word and likely spending hours just listening to Jesus talk. And this is one of the reasons that the religious leaders hated him so badly. He is drawing people away from him. He is jealous. They're jealous of him and what he has done. He's breaking up these lies that they've told the people and ruining the monopoly that they've created over those who have been forced to follow them. So they've got a plan. They've been working. You can tell for a while they've been working on this plan. And so what they do is they have this lady that's been caught in the act of adultery. And they take this woman, they drag her into the middle of the temple, and they put her in front of Jesus as this crowd is standing around him and said, "We've got something for you here." Now, this is an interesting place, and there are some real problems with this. One, you can't commit adultery alone. Why this woman? Where's the man? Why are they only interested in her? Why now? If they were so new about this, why hadn't they dealt with this before? Because they had a responsibility as religious leaders to deal with this type of activity, this type of sinfulness in their midst. They chose today to go grab this woman that they obviously were aware of a situation that they completely knew was going on. And why now? Why in the midst of this temple? Why right here as this feast is going on and it's such a public setting to bring her up? Why not take her to the council where they would examine her and particularly the guy that she's involved with and deal with them themselves and exact punishment upon them? And then why bring him to Jesus? Who is he? They've already said they don't believe what he says and they don't want to hear his words and they don't find him to be credible at all. Why bring him to Jesus? He's not a judge. He's not a part of your council. So why would you want him to be involved? Well, we find out very quickly the answer to all these questions. Why now? Why Jesus? Why here? Why this particular person? Why these circumstances? Because it is a test. They're testing Jesus. And it's a crazy thing because they believe that they've worked this out. But in the intelligence they have, we've got Jesus backed into a corner. We've got a test that he can never answer. There is no right way out of this. It's like recently there was another state that borders us that has a standardized test. And the school districts began to complain because there was actually a test on this standard. There was a question on this test that had no right answer. You simply could not get it right no matter what you did. Well, this is where they've got Jesus. It is a testing. And we're all prone to tests, right? We're all prone to push the limits, particularly as kids. We test them with parents. If you're a parent, you've got kids, you know that. You see how close you can get to the line. How far can I go? Maybe can I get my toe across the line? How much can I push mom and dad until I finally get their reaction? We love to test the limits. We love to push things to that place. And they've got Jesus here to question that they think he can't answer. It's like they did it earlier if you'll remember, in Matthew chapter 4, as they had cornered him into this place. Jesus had been in the wilderness for 40 days. And at the end of it, Satan comes to him, and among the different questions and scenarios he puts in front of him, he takes him on top of the temple, he says, "Jump. If you're truly the Messiah, jump. God will not allow you to hurt yourself when you land." And Jesus responds in kind, in the most appropriate way. You don't put God to the test. You don't test God. You will not win that contest, ever. It is not one that you will come out ahead on. And they're trying at this point to test God. See, here's what they see in this situation. They've got this woman who's legitimately being caught in adultery. Jesus never questions that. He never says, no, she's innocent. He never doubts the guiltiness of what she's done. She's obviously guilty. He never fights against that. That's not the point of this. See, the point of this is the test, and they figure he can't find a way to wiggle out of. if he says, yes, you go ahead and stone her, according to the law says that you execute both the man and the woman caught in adultery. That would change the 21st century culture, huh? You destroy them, you remove them from your midst and get rid of the evil that's in your land. Now, it didn't say specifically stoning, it was just the means in which it was accepted at that time to execute people for sinfulness. And so if he says, yes, you go with the law and you have them executed, then now all of a sudden he's contradicted himself because he's been teaching people grace and he's been teaching people mercy and forgiveness. How can you say that when you've been telling the people all along that we should be merciful, we should be filled with grace? And now you want the law observed? See, he's a phony. He's a fake. We told you all along he was just making stuff up. You people shouldn't listen to him. They got him. But on the other hand, maybe he says, you know what? No, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't obey the law. You shouldn't listen to what it says, and you should set her free. Well, now he's contradicting the law. He's a heretic. Now they've got him. Oh, they hope he chooses option number 2. Oh, they so wanted to pick that one. They've got real charges against him. At that point, they drag him before the council and have him convicted and executed, problem solved. Oh, please choose a second option. Please do that. But what does Jesus do? It's like he had done before. If you remember Matthew 22, they had a similar test for him. Hey, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar? They're testing him again. All right, give me a coin. Whose picture is on this coin? Well, Caesar. Okay, then you give to Caesar what's Caesar, and you give to God what's God's. You can't win that battle. You can't take God on and ever come out ahead. And once again, Jesus is put in one of these places of not understanding what's going on and them not having a clear picture of who he is. And they want to challenge him. They want to take him on, but he doesn't respond to them. In fact, he bends down, he stoops down, and he begins to write with his finger in the dirt. Now, there have been debates for centuries between biblical scholars, theologians, seminary classes about what Jesus wrote in the sand. We'll never know. There's been volumes and gallons of ink spilled writing about what Jesus wrote in the sand. We will never know. If it was for us to know, it would have been recorded. But he simply writes in the sand. But they're not through with him. They're not going to let him out of this. Jesus, we want an answer. We want to know something, Jesus. You tell us. What is the solution to our problem here? Do we stone her or do we set her free? What do you say, Jesus? And Jesus very clearly tells them, whoever without you without sin, he should be the one to throw the first stone. And Jesus is referring back to Deuteronomy chapter 13 and 17. If you caught someone in an act like this that deserved death, if you were the witness to it, you were the first one to throw the stone. You got to throw out the first pitch, in other words. But you also couldn't be guilty of the same thing. That's a problem. If we witnessed her, then it gives us the right, but if we're guilty too, they know they couldn't be involved. And what did Jesus say about adultery in Matthew chapter 5? He said adultery is a horrible thing. But he says, whoever looks upon another person with lustful intent, for him, that's already adultery. It's already, he doesn't abolish the law, he fulfills it. He doesn't take it away, he actually raises the standard on it. It's not just a physical act anymore, it's a heart condition now. Whoever looks upon another person in lustful intent, that person's already guilty. So he's taking them to a whole other place. Wait a minute, how are we supposed to get by with that? So if you take all this in mind, if you bear all this up, what Jesus is saying, whoever's without sin should be the first one to cast a stone. And if you're not guilty of it, then you go right ahead. The only person in this crowd, the only person to ever live on the face of this earth, the only one qualified to throw a rock at her was Jesus. He's the only one that could do it. He's the only one that had the right to judge her, to convict her, and executed her. No one else could, not in right. Now, this is not saying that every judge and every jury has to be filled with sinless people or we would never convict anybody, right? But we're not talking about man's law. We're talking about God's law here. And what Jesus is calling for is a gracious response to judgment. It's a gracious response because without it, it's nothing but legalism. Without it, it's nothing but just puffing ourselves up. Because just like these Pharisees did, they saw this woman and they looked down on her. They probably gossiped about her. And they saw her as less than what they were, and they could use her, and they could use the law to try to trap Jesus. See, we often do the same thing. We come to a very judgmental place, and we really don't think about who we are when we do it. And we see the other person, we see them as less than what we are, and we look down at them, and we, in turn, gossip about that person, and we view them differently than we view other people, especially ourselves. And it leads us to a place of being very judgmental. But Christ calls us to be different. He exalts himself above the law in this situation, but he calls for a righteousness that's based upon grace. See, can you imagine this woman's situation? Caught in the act of adultery, dragged in front of this crowd of people there in the middle of the temple in the most public of places, and then to have her sin exposed before everybody. They disgraced her in the most profound way that they could think of. They drug her through the mud. But Jesus took her disgrace and he covered it with his grace. Jesus made things right again because he saw her from a merciful perspective. He knew she was flawed, but she was no more flawed than the ones who had put her there. It was not a difference, and they had no right. See, it becomes a hypocrisy and our self-righteousness that we think justice belongs to us. Not based upon a gracious spirit, but a very legalistic place. And this is not church discipline. That's a whole different conversation. This is about us judging the world around us. Bob Hoover was an incredible pilot. And he was a wonderful test pilot. Worked for years testing new planes, the latest ones to come along. And he would do a lot of air shows. And one particular day, he was leaving an air show in his airplane, and he's flying along, and all of a sudden, both engines just quit. Mid-flight, both engines just, out of nowhere, just stop. Well, a couple of things happened. One, with the skill that he has as a pilot, he was able to safely land his airplane, and he and his two passengers were fine. Everything was good. The other thing that happened is he knew what had happened. He said, I guarantee you somebody took my airplane and filled it with jet fuel. And so when he got back, he says, I want to know who fueled my airplane. I want to know who did it. And so the guy that had filled his airplane and with much apprehension, and I mean, you almost killed a legend. I mean, mid-flight, his engine stopped because of you. And so with much trepidation, he says, it was me. And Bob Hoover goes to him and he puts his arm around him. In the most gracious way, he says, I'm just showing you, I know you'll never do that again. And in fact, tomorrow, I want you to fuel my plane. See, forgiveness is more than just a one-time act or maybe an occasional act. It is a heart condition. It is a real attitude of gracious living and being merciful and understanding my place in God's economy along with everyone else. And it does not give me the right to be judgmental towards those around me, to lack forgiveness, because who has forgiven more than God has? Nobody. If he's forgiven us, how much more would we forgive others? If he's shown us grace, how much more would we show each other grace? If we've experienced mercy without merit, how much more should we give it to others who don't deserve it either? It goes back to a place in Matthew chapter 9 when he's addressing the Pharisees in a place. He said, there's something you guys need to figure out. He says, you guys need to sit down and you think about this. I desire mercy more than sacrifice. I don't care about you bringing bulls here and slaughtering them, and I don't care about you bringing me all these different types of offerings and stuff like that. I want you to show mercy. I want you to let people experience the same grace that you experienced. And I want you to do it in a genuine love for one another. That's what I want. By the time we get to verse 9, these guys are standing there. They're still standing there around this woman and Jesus, and obviously they're conflicted. Their conscience screaming at them. Whichever one of you is without sin, you throw the first pitch. And they realize their hypocrisy. They realize the place that they're at. They realize they have no right to even be there. They realize that they're up to here in the old mud that they've created. And they've got no way out. And apparently from wisdom, maybe, the older ones, they turn and walk away. Had to be frustrated. They tried again. They tried again to catch Jesus, and he couldn't do it. And they turn and walk away. Then the younger ones, probably a little more rebellious, a little longer it takes it to sink in for them. And they're gone. Because Jesus had given them time to rushness as he continues to ride in the sand. After they leave, all these guys are gone there, and it's just Jesus and this woman. Just the two of them, and he's still riding in the sand, and he stands back up and looks at her and says, "Where are the guys? What happened? Is there not someone left here to condemn you?" And she says, "No, there's not." He says, "I don't condemn you either, but listen to his words, because this is where it really hinges here. I don't condemn you either, because Jesus didn't come in the world to condemn the world, but to save it. I don't condemn you either, but go on from now and sin no more." In other words, very literally speaking, what he says is, leave your life of sin. Leave it behind. If you remember, a few weeks ago, we looked at John chapter 5, and Jesus heals the invalid. 38 years, he's laid on his back, hoping to be healed of it. And Jesus walks in and says, "Get up, take your bed, and go home." And later, Jesus finds the guy in the temple, and he's worshiping God because of his miraculous healing. And Jesus says, "Look, you can walk again. This is great." And he tells him, "Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." Sin no more. Jesus doesn't condone her and what she's done. He doesn't declare her to be innocent of what she's done. He knows she's guilty. He doesn't give her license to go do what she wants to. In fact, what he does, he gives her reason to stop. For the first time, somebody's given her a real reason to stop the sin in her life. That's what he's done for her. He doesn't say, "Oh, you can just be as sinful as you want to be. I'll take care of it. Just let me know if you get in trouble again. Just tell them to come find me. If you get any more trouble, I'll be there to help you." That's not what he's saying here. It's not what he says to you and I today. See, too many of us have this idea of a very cheap grace. A very cheap grace. I can do what I want to do. Jesus will forgive me again. And I'll do it. I know I'm not supposed to do it, but I know I'll go to Jesus and I'll say, "Jesus, I'm sorry, forgive me again." And we do it over. And folks, that is taking God's grace and just cheapening it down to nothing. That's making wholesale junk out of it. That is not the reason God saves us. He saves us to take us to a new place, a new life, to be something different than what we were before. So when he saves us, it's not to just keep doing what we've always been doing, but he saves us to turn us around 180 degrees and say, "Now, sin no more. Leave the life of sin that you've been leading. Get away from it." See, Jesus didn't come to the world to condemn it. He came to set it free, to show it mercy, to show grace. You see, the law is fulfilled, not abolished in Jesus. It's fulfilled in Jesus, and it's fulfilled by love, a love for God and a love for each other. It is the vertical plane with our relationship with God, and we give him the love that he has given us. And then we reciprocate that love to those around us on a horizontal plane. To show the love of the world that God has shown to us. See, we were all right where she was. We were all standing right in that very place that woman was standing, deserving death for the sin in our lives. We did. Every last one of us deserved death because of our sinfulness. And if you know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, he did the very same thing. He stepped in. He stepped in and said, "Nope, that one's mine. I'm taking the punishment for that one. And he sets us free, but he sets us free to a new life. A life that we don't sin anymore, but a life of newness. He didn't save her so she could continue doing. He didn't save us so we could continue doing what we had done as lost people. He calls us to leave sin behind and follow him in righteousness. And we agree with that, but too often we don't live as though we do. We live as always, there's always one more time. One more, Jesus, just one more. I know I'll do it again, and our mouths sputter foulness, and our lives are lived with sinfulness, and just with this recognition, Jesus, tomorrow I'll pray and ask you to forgive me again, and it'll all be covered again. It's not what Jesus says. Leave your life of sin. No more. It's not the point of what he did here. See, Jesus, in this situation, he leveled the field here by making those guys admit each of their own sin, their own hypocrisy. And then instead of condemning her for what she had done, he forgives her. He forgives her. But not only does he forgive her, but he transforms her into something different. He makes her new again. See, there are a couple of issues going on with a couple of different groups here. See, first you've got this woman in the situation, and she felt like she could live a life of sin and that there wouldn't be consequences for it. That she could go on and doing the things that she was doing that she knew were contrary to God, and it would all be fine. It would all simply work out. But the reality of it is, it almost cost her her life. She was almost wiped out because of her sinfulness. And see, we can't live in this world thinking, oh, well, I can just continue to sin like I want to. It'll all be okay. No big deal. Won't be a problem. I guarantee you it won't be. I guarantee there'll be an account made for every sin in our lives. And apart from Jesus Christ, we will be held responsible for them. Eternity is a long time to be wrong. But then you got the other group here. You've got the religious elite here who felt as though they could live this life of following the law and really looking the part and playing the part and saying all the right things, generally being good people. And by the world standards, yeah, these guys were generally good people. I mean, they were the religious leaders, right? They were doing the right things. They were saying the right things. The problem is these guys were lost as a goose in a snowstorm. They had no clue what was going on. They tried to take on God, and they would again. And they thought that all their acts, all their deeds, all their things that they've done would finally some way to get them to heaven. But I promise you, folks, on our very best day, the day that I've sinned the least and I've been the best person I could be, it is like filthy rags to God. And it will never earn me a place in heaven because it can't be earned. And yet simply these guys felt as though they could do it this way. And they encountered God, and he brushed them away. They realized their hypocrisy. They realized their lostness. They realized their brokenness. They pretended, but their pretending left them hollow inside with nothing to show for it. There's a good chance this morning that there are people in here who are guilty of being very judgmental of others, of looking down your nose at others and seeing them as less while puffing yourself up, while creating this image of another person that allows you to judge them, to gossip about them, to put them down. If that's the case, then today is a day of repentance, and it's time to get that right. It could be today that you have held back forgiveness, that you have forgotten the forgiveness that you have received from God, not a forgiveness that you deserved or you could ever earn, but a forgiveness that was bestowed upon you by the grace and mercy of the Almighty. But you've been unwilling to give that forgiveness to others, even though anything that they've done to you far fails in comparison to what you've done to God. Today is a day of repentance to offer that forgiveness that you've held back. It could be today that you're living in sin. Maybe you know Christ, but you are not living as though you do. You feel as though His grace is cheap and you can just continue to live the way you want to and just hope it works out. It won't. Today is the day to get right with Jesus. To once and for all turn your life over to Him. Allow Him to take away the sins that you've been living in. Even if it's a hypocritical existence of saying that you know God, but living as if you only know the world. And then finally, it could be that you are in a place of very legalistic. You know, if I'm just a good person, if I'm just a really good person, and maybe I don't murder anybody my whole life, then God has to let me into heaven. You've got the formula all wrong. Because I'll tell you, good people, according to this world standard, good people die every day and go to hell. Because apart from Jesus Christ and the mercy that He gives us, from the life that He bestows upon us, from Him setting us free, it's the only option that's left. Not that God wants to send people to hell, but people reject God and they offend God. That's simply what it deserves. Life itself.